Welcome everyone to our Office Shock Talks. This is our second Office Shock Talk focusing on one of our spectrums. And I'm really excited. Today we're going to be speaking with Ramona Liberoff about the spectrum of climate impact. For those of you who might have missed our previous Office Shock talk, that was on the spectrum of purpose with Professor Lonnie Brooks. That is on the IFTF LinkedIn page and also on YouTube. You can watch those videos. And of course, you'll also find there the recordings of our Office Shock book launch and also the introduction to future back thinking. So for today's talk, Ramona, who is the executive director of PACE, Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy. And this is a really important platform, not only because of the work that Ramona is doing, but also because it is part of the World Resources Institute, a global organization that is focused on creating metrics that will be influencing climate choices for individuals, organizations, and potentially communities as well. So the platform and what Ramona is going to be sharing with us is exciting because it's the way to bring people together. And as we've said before, Office Shock is all about trying to bring people together to have these kinds of conversations about these spectrums of choice, the spectrums that have been opened up by the shock of the workplace and all of the other shocks that have been happening globally. Climate change, unfortunately, seeing what's happening now in Turkey and Syria with the earthquake, the continuing war in Ukraine, inflation, energy, and there's always the specter of another pandemic on the horizon. So all of these shocks, again, opening up opportunities for us to think differently, to think future back about what is the future that we want, that better future. What are going to be some of the experiences? What's next if that's the future? And then, again, to inform the conversations and choices about what do we do now. So, Ramona, again, so happy to have you and really looking forward to hearing more about PACE. First, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and how did you get into this space?
Thank you, Joseph, and to you and the IFTF team for having me. It's a real honor to be able to talk about these topics. In terms of my own background, I'm a bit of an unusual not-for-profit person because I spent the first half of my career roughly very much in for-profit innovation. I was leading teams that were helping the likes of large consumer goods manufacturers and others who were very much focused on economic growth and consumerism to figure out what increasingly affluent people around the world needed or thought they needed or could be made to need and spend money on. But somewhere around 2010, I had an epiphany. There were small teams within our clients that were working on what was known then as social innovation, or trying to figure out how to meet the basic needs in terms of human dignity and a good quality of life for billions of people around the planet. And I thought, actually, I think I want to do that instead of trying to serve the 10% or 20%. And that began a shift into a career that's included impact investing, working in international development, and now leading PACE.
Fantastic. Tell us a bit about PACE and also how does it fit into the World Resources Institute mission?
Happy to. So PACE, or the Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy, was a creation from Davos, where a group of leaders, championed at the time by the ex-CEO of Philips, Frans van Houten, got together and said, actually, we really need to work together as a collaborative community of leaders to inspire people to both understand and act upon the circular economy. And from those beginnings a few years ago, we have a board of about a dozen leaders and a further group of 75 to 80 individuals and institutions, corporate, public, and not-for-profit, as well as leading knowledge partners that are all trying to figure out how we re-engineer our systems and how we execute a rapid systems change away from a take-make-waste linear model and toward a very, very different economy. It fits into WRI very well, actually, because even though it is a separate initiative, the World Resources Institute, the clue is in the name, is all about trying to figure out what choices we should make to honor the fact that we're living well beyond our planetary boundaries, and how to use resources like land, water, forests, and so on more efficiently. So we work quite closely together on topics such as energy and minerals for the energy transition, for example.
So before we get into some of the stories and experiences that you've had in PACE, probably worthwhile just to set the baseline. You mentioned those critical resources. You mentioned planetary boundaries. In your view, how do you define circular economy?
What an excellent question. And I think I could write a book just on definitions of the circular economy alone. But to spare you and your listeners, the way that I would posit circular economy is as an alternative to our linear economy. It's about being exceptionally resource conscious and resource creative. And the companies and governments that we see thinking in this way, for example, like the Netherlands, like some of the Nordic countries, or companies like Apple or like Accenture, are really reframing how they do business with an awareness of resources right at the heart. And this is leading to all kinds of very exciting and very unusual, rich collaborations across what used to be value chains and are now networks of shared value.
Fascinating. How do those networks of shared value play out in the spectrum that we wrote about in the Office Shock book between net zero and regenerative?
Mm-hmm. I think it varies, quite honestly. Regenerative would be the absolute ideal, but there are many ways in which that platonic ideal of regeneration is not yet achievable. A lot of this is, for example, to do with the gap in being able to compete on a like-for-like basis. If you are a business, or even if you're a nation, the grounds aren't there yet for you to be able to do this sort of work. Is more complex and more expensive by and large, and requires very, very different relationships. So I'd say we're somewhere on the journey between committing to net zero and figuring out how to be regenerative.
Is there an example or two that you could share just to understand where we are on that spectrum?
Yes, certainly. So if we think about some of the issues that are common across sectors in the circular economy, one of the things you need to do is build a loop. So at the moment, things are made, we go and we buy them. But then there isn't really the infrastructure there to return them. And we're really at the very, very early stages. For example, I was at an all-day workshop on fashion and textiles. We're at the very early stages of trying to figure out how to recapture the things that are already out there. Someone made a brilliant comment today, which is that the future cotton fields are actually already in our closets. But of course, who bears the cost and the responsibility to try and get those things out of our closets and back into production? Should it be the consumer? Should it be the manufacturer? Should it be the retailer? Should it be a bit of everyone? Those things are simply not clear, but there is certainly an added cost to doing the right thing and to closing the loop. And that's where we're trying to figure that out in different areas, and what kinds of collaborations are needed to make that viable.
What have you seen to be as essential for those collaborations to be viable?
Great question. Certainly, target setting. You mentioned metrics in your introduction of WRI, and I think what gets measured does get managed. And for example, we've just launched at Davos with Accenture, one of our corporate partners, some target setting guidance for circularity, which doesn't try and create a different metric for circularity, but makes sense of what was described as the soup of metrics out there that combine climate and the use of materials in one sort of framework. So you could really think in a circular fashion without having to create yet another number. People are already struggling to measure what they need to already, but you need a framework to understand it.
So in the book, you might recall that we made reference to the Jeans Redesign Project.
Yes.
Curious your thoughts about that as an example of bringing together across what used to be a supply chain, but now, to your point, a network, bringing people together to be able to implement a circularly designed, in this case, jeans.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I thought it was a brilliant example of thinking about the production side. But I would have been interested to hear if there had been government representatives or public policy representatives or even consumers present in the Jeans Redesign program, because I think the future is really genuinely multi-stakeholder collaboration. What's interesting is you find when you involve citizens and consumers, you often end up with a much more progressive outcome than you would have done if you basically invite people who are already in the system to collaborate together. So I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at that conversation.
Yeah, I think I would have enjoyed that as well. I think for those of you who are listening, that specific case study is on the Ellen MacArthur website called Genes Redesign. You can look that up, and there's a great video. I'd also be curious to know what has been the uptake of recycled jeans. I know that my jeans that I'm wearing and the ones that I have in my closet are not recyclable because of some of the design choices that I bought.
Yep. And if I might say one other thing about that, we forget that it really goes reduce, reuse, recycle. And I find personally, for my taste, in consumer areas, too much emphasis is placed on recycling or handling the end of the problem rather than really getting people to think about reducing the use of materials in the first place, reducing their consumption, and also reuse models. So I really would see recycling as a last resort.
Where do you see the reduction of consumption playing an important role in, again, making choices on that spectrum?
I mean, everywhere, basically. If we think about the fact that we're in planetary overshoot, we are using far more materials than we can safely or sensibly extract. I call it a couple of areas for particular consideration. The first is food. I mean, no surprise, we've faced food price inflation and shocks, and also all kinds of dramatic instabilities exacerbated by conflict in the supply chain. But if we think that even still in Western Europe, nearly a third of the food that we buy is purely wasted. I think that's a huge opportunity. There's also a huge opportunity to valorize the waste that comes about in the food production system before it is even harvested. And that's something that PACE is working on. Looking at it a different way, we have to basically do a lot of work to get minerals and materials for the energy transition. We face the transition of an energy system faster than anyone could ever imagine, from fossil fuel-based to renewables. But actually 30 to 50% of those materials that we need are, again, already out there. So we just need to get much, much better at recapturing them in things like urban mines.
So I hear potentially you've got a point of view on the criticality of raw earth minerals.
Not just rare earths, although obviously they're because technically there's sufficient quantity, but often the situations in which they are mined are quite difficult. And also we're simply not going to be able to get the extractive capacity up to speed in the time that we need it. We must do everything. Think about all the critical materials, including things like copper, as well as things like lithium and other rare earths.
Materials, yeah. So it's really a question not only of being able to change the technologies to be more renewable, and obviously those rare earth materials are critical for that. But if I hear you saying this idea of circularity has a very important aspect of consumption and also production, very much in the space of the workshop that you ran today.
Yep, and the whole of SDG 12. You know, we need responsible practices in both of those things.
So now that you mentioned SDG 12, what, in your experience and your views, is the role of SDGs in helping to accelerate this transition to a more circular economy, and ideally a future that is more balanced and better from a climate perspective?
A great question. I mean, I started this kind of work before the SDGs came into force. And I think they've done three very useful things. One is they've given us a language to talk about the bare minimum that we believe every human being deserves. So if you think about no poverty, adequate nutrition, education, gender equality, these are things that we all need for a better world. In fact, a nice bit of SDG trivia is that SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, was at one point the first on the list as a sort of base condition for all human flourishing. I think the second thing it's done, it's given us some useful targets to measure progress against. And we are progressing in some areas faster than others. And we were certainly progressing faster than the pandemic. So being able to measure our progress and understand where we're winning and why is quite important. And I think the third thing is it's really given us, I think people think of the SDGs as a list, but they're not. They're actually a wheel. They are a system in and of themselves. And if you think about the fact that on Project Drawdown's list of must-dos for the planet, girls' education is number 6 out of the top 10, that gives you a sense of how interrelated and interconnected these challenges actually are.
Yeah, I've actually recently seen some new graphics where it represents the SDGs as a layer cake.
Mhm.
And that really highlights the interdependencies. If I may, Ramona, I'll add a fourth benefit of the SDGs. And one of the reasons why, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, that we used it in the book Office Shock, the fourth reason is that the SDGs gives an opportunity for an aspiration for a better future. And what we also wrote about in the book was the importance of the SDGs having some level of ambiguity. And for futures work, and most importantly, mobilizing people towards a different future, that means change. Having that ambiguity, certainly in a lot of our work, has been critical because it's a much safer space to be in. So you're 10 years into the future, you're getting out of that present forward thinking, which we are hardwired to focus on because that's what's enabled us to survive until now. However, it's also going to be what will destroy us. So the idea of being able to put yourself in the future is overcoming those cognitive biases. And then when you're in that space, it's a much safer space because everyone is leaving those biases behind. And that's where the imagination of what a future, for example, of a circular economy could be in an organization, if it's for a business, in a community, or within neighborhoods. And then clearly as individuals, if you're able to then put yourself there, then ideally you have the space to think about, well, what kind of choices do I want to make now in order to be future ready? Have you seen in your work the importance or the ability or the need to be able to get people into that safer space, to be able to start thinking about what a more circular future might feel and look like?
Great question. I mean, I did futures work back in my career, at that point in the service of multinationals, but also some governments and others. And you're absolutely right that this ability to backcast, to sort of imagine yourself at an unspecified or specified point in the future and say, what does the world look like, feel like, taste like, what's around you? I think it's incredibly important. The challenge I see is a lot of circular economy discussions have been approached through a lens of very technocratic sustainability. We talk about policies, we talk about technologies, we talk about business models and cost curves. Rarely do we talk about the importance of leadership, and rarely do we talk about the importance of imagining a better world. And that's something I really want to make sure that we build into our work. And we'll have to advocate to those who fund us for the importance of this, in fact, the criticality of it, in order to be able to achieve our work.
Tell us a little bit more about that criticality on both the leadership side and also the ability to imagine those better futures.
Yep. And I think with circular economy, the biggest challenge is people don't know where to start. And I think part of the reason they don't know where to start, apart from it being complex and interrelated, requiring different relationships, often requiring funding, I think that the problem is they don't know where they want to get to. So what you find in the people who are really pioneers in this space, they committed a long time ago to a culture of continuous experimentation, but they also had a vision and a set of values that demanded action. And I think the ability to really think, where are we going and what will it be like when we get there, can provide a lot of impetus and energy, and some shared value for people in an organization, whether that's a government or a policymaking body or a company, to really put the extra effort in to try and do this work, because this isn't easy.
Now, you had mentioned leadership. Tell us about the importance of leadership in this kind of a grand challenge, which, as you said, is not easy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think without leadership, you cannot get anywhere. And I think part of the challenge is the system rewards those who have managed to succeed in our current linear model. And people are almost hardwired at this point with assumptions that the linear economy is the economy. It is not the economy, it is an economy. And in a way, the organizations we've worked with, where they truly have circularity at their heart, often have visionary leaders who simply believe there must be a better way. But they've managed to straddle that divide and satisfy those of their stakeholders, who really want the company to succeed in their current environment. Paul Polman at Unilever was one of these, for example, driving the sustainable living plan and purpose in the business while continuing to improve returns to shareholders. It's a good trick if you can do it.
Yes, and I definitely think Paul Polman, which we also mentioned in the book, is certainly an example. What other examples come to mind that maybe aren't as high profile that you see are facing those challenges and actually making a difference on the ground?
I'll give a call out to a couple of our stakeholders. Celsa Group are a family-owned steel group in Barcelona, and they, from their own impetus, their own leadership culture, they have embraced, with a new initiative called Be Circular, a whole industrial symbiosis project. And they've basically kicked this off because they can imagine a world in which Barcelona becomes this fully circular economy. And they've brought this sort of energy and leadership to this challenge. And they will hopefully, through this, provide a demonstrable example of what that can look like, which can then go on to inspire and serve as a model for others. So I'd say they're an example. I would say that, the discussion we were in today was hosted by ING, which is a Dutch bank. And the way the targets they've set themselves for the quantity of sustainable finance, but also the efforts and investment they make in community building without an explicit commercial payback or a short-term commercial payback is the kind of thing we need to see more of. So those are always very inspiring. Neither of these are our funders. They're just people who I've seen do good things when they didn't have to.
Well, I'm curious, particularly in the example of the steel manufacturer in Barcelona, what have you seen as being the critical success factors for them, and maybe just a little bit of background, where are they in that aspiration to turn Barcelona into a completely circular community?
I think it comes back to leadership again. The fact that they are a family company where these values are deeply held through the generations, the fact that they can think long term, and the fact that they have decided. I think a lot of these initiatives actually work very well at a local or regional level where you know people and you feel you have something in common and a stake in the game. It's all very well to say we're all citizens of the earth, but the truth is we're citizens of a place. And I think the most effective initiatives in these areas are cross-sector and to an extent place-based, because that allows for the greatest sort of knitting together of social fabric. They are right now at the beginning of Be Circular. The initiative has just kicked off, but I'm sure they have the commitment to really see it through, and they've done the engagement work with other industrials in their sector. So I think this kind of place-based cross-sector initiative is really a model for what a good future needs to look like.
And it's interesting because it really does connect with a regenerative economy, which is much more agricultural and also place-based as well.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Net Zero would be the company itself, and they're almost there, really sort of doing everything they possibly could on steel manufacture. Regeneration would be saying, for the future of our community 100 years hence, what do we need to start? How do we need to start acting now? And most people we meet are much, much closer to net zero than they are to regeneration. Countries as well as companies.
Yes. And what I also heard when you mentioned the community building that they're probably doing in Barcelona, and you mentioned ING as well. You've read the book. What are the other 2 or 3 spectrums that you think are essential to be able to move the needle up, ideally, on the spectrum of climate impact?
Well, gosh. Reading the book to me just made perfect sense, but that's because it's where I spend all of my time and my energy, and with people who agree. But I realize that in the rest of the world, it's really not like that. I won't remember the exact chapter titles, but in terms of sentiment, I think a far greater awareness and connection to the rest of the world, is incredibly important. And in a way, it's interesting that you located it in an office, which is by design a place that is private and cloistered and often seen as apart from society. If I think about the number of security checkpoints you have to go through to get into many offices. It reinforces that sense of being a private space. But actually, if you take every employee that comes in and they bring the awareness of the world in with them, that's incredibly important. And I think the other thing is around kind of collaboration, around really being curious and collaborative and always thinking about the opportunities of how to work together better, which is again something that an office can be uniquely positioned. If managed correctly, it can be a wonderful space for that.
Well, it's a great insight. When you talk about the importance of the office, the physical environment, cloistered, closing people in, if people are able to have that more growth mindset, to be able to bring the outside in, that was the inspiration for the illustration of the chapter right before climate. I'm not going to test you on the chapter titles, which is the spectrum of outcomes. And the spectrum of outcomes illustration has that office building in the background, and there's water that is cascading down into a more agrarian economy, and the water representing that connection. So I didn't even think about that, but it's a wonderful, important metaphor that ideally everyone within an office or wherever you may be working, to see the broader systems and networks that you're actually having an influence on.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And to your point, even if you think about the built environment, you'll think about it very differently if you're considering the context and the environment that it's in and what role a building as a citizen itself of a community plays.
Yeah, indeed. And your point also about, the collaboration, because the collaboration will enable you to then think about how do you engage with your neighbors, your citizens, et cetera. Collaboration, what we talked about in that chapter, that's the spectrum of agility. We emphasize the importance of gameful cooperation, and all of the digital natives and generation that are growing up playing those massively online player games where you're actually in a digital environment, but you've got to work together in this more gameful environment. We believe those are the skills that are going to be essential for that kind of cooperation that would ideally influence that kind of systemic thinking, which should ultimately influence the choices on topics like climate.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
So all of that sounds good, and you've shared a couple of examples, and PACE is humming along, making an impact. What are the top 2 or 3 challenges that are keeping up at night?
Only 2 or 3. I think the very first is simply the sustained nature of this work. Back in my commercial days, it was very easy to feel like I had a day where something went well. But what I realize is that when you work on these sorts of challenges, you never have a day when you're purely satisfied, because obviously the scope and scale of the problem relative to your own resources and even the world's awareness, the gap is just too wide. So, I get kept up more at night just by the scope and scale of the challenge than anything that's actually happening. I think the second thing is really what torments me is trying to figure out the DNA of the most effective, successful scale and speed collaboration. I don't think it's something we really understand yet because so much of that is so new. We've grown up in a world that is hyper competitive, that does not take the time for deep understanding and knowledge. So, that's another thing we need to figure out. And I guess the third is also we need to experiment quite quickly, but we're actually having a discussion with philanthropists tomorrow to try and explain why a lot of the classic funding models for not-for-profits do not allow very readily for experimentation. They have tended to be very much focused on output, which is obviously not neatly aligned with the work of systems change.
Right.
So those are a few things.
Yeah, no, those are pretty good. When, as you were describing those, I had in my mind the importance of being able to feel a sense of belonging in the community. I'll take, for example, PACE. How have you been trying to create that sense of belonging in the platform to be able to achieve some of these critical objectives?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm relatively new into the role at 4 months, But what I've observed works well is just constantly connecting and reconnecting to stakeholders. And given that we have more than 100 of those, that itself is more than a full-time job.
Yeah.
But just trying to remember what is important to everyone as I get to know them. For example, we have a few stakeholders who are very, very keen, near professional musicians, and remembering that this is something important to them. Or it's not always about the work. It's really about the human beings. Their families, their interests, their principles, their values. And I think sometimes people forget to keep that in mind. As I say, given the scope and scale of the technical challenge, people sometimes overfocus on that. So trying to bring more of that humanity into all of our interactions whenever possible.
So since you mentioned humanity, our chapter after belonging and before place and time is about augmentation. And that spectrum, if you recall, human to technology, it's the human machine conundrum. And in that chapter, we talk about the importance of making a decision about where technology can actually help us and where should it do the things that maybe aren't adding that much value. And of course, the whole world, particularly in my world and probably in your world as well, everyone is quite excited, but also a bit anxious about generative AI. So ChatGPT grabbing most of the headlines. I read this morning that Google is going to be coming out. I believe they're testing right now internally Bard, B-A-R-D, which is based on Lambda, which we also referred to in the book. Curious your views on that generative AI, and does that offer a glimmer of hope to help bring more humanity into the platforms and into this grand challenge of the climate crisis?
It's interesting. I didn't see sort of social and technology as being two different ends of a spectrum. I think part of it is there are such things as social technologies. And there are ways of using technology to achieve social outcomes. I mean, the very fact that we're speaking, at a distance of hundreds or perhaps 1,000 miles at this point, kind of in occupying a virtual space and time, but still able to exchange ideas is a good example of that. But how we use the technology is really the question. Will things like generative AI actually help us? Yes and no. I mean, I think in some ways they'll make material more accessible, but they also run the risk of making the complex look simple. And I've played around with ChatGPT and sort of trying to figure out, can it help me actually write communications? At the end of the day, the answer was no, because all it did was aggregate the banal generalities that are already out there. And it wasn't particularly good at actually picking out stories. Perhaps in a few years' time, it will have gotten better at the very human art of the anecdote.
The human art of the anecdote. That's beautiful. And we always emphasize throughout the book the importance of storytelling, but we also emphasize the importance of story making. And that's also just happens to be a title of a book that I was a co-author on. We did some research at the Politecnico di Milano, where I'm a visiting professor. Curious your views on storytelling versus story making.
Well, a little bit looping back to our earlier conversation, you need to have stories to tell. And the only way to make a story is to embark on the sort of messy business of trying something out. Only once you experiment and once you collaborate can you then tell a story about what happened, what you learned from it, and then help others. Because stories are effectively handholds through human experience.
What have been some of the stories that you found valuable to do that hand-holding in the space of climate impact? Is there that story that just resonates with everyone? Because we're all aware of climate. We've been told about it, we've heard about it, we've seen the details, but it still hasn't moved the needle. It hasn't gotten to that tipping point where everyone is on board, mobilized for collective action.
I mean, I think it's actually moved the needle a lot, just maybe not in the time frame with the urgency and full focus we needed to. It took us 170 odd years to get to this point, and we've actually moved remarkably quickly in the last 15 or so. But in terms of the helpful stories, what I find useful is to ask people, just what made them aware. What was the first time they can remember being aware of the climate situation? And people's responses are often very, very interesting. You ask a smallholder farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, and they'll describe a particular growing season and knowing intimately that something was off. You ask potentially a CEO who's gone on a mind-expanding trip to Greenland and stood in front of a glacier and confronted, how small he or she is in the face of the existential crises. So I find those origin stories to be extremely useful.
That's very powerful and a wonderful, encouragement for all of us to try to find those origin stories. So if that is going to motivate the individual, what do you think would motivate an organization?
I think people need psychological safety. This is no great revelation, in order to do both their best work and also to know that they will be rewarded for experiments. Again, this sort of work is highly experimental, and you are bound to fail. But in failing, you contribute to others' learning. So I just think that creating that environment where people understand that failure is not only acceptable, but also a necessary part of learning is a key part of this, for example.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So those stories, understanding where we are and where do we need to go, as we spoke about earlier, that is something that in organizations is usually manifest in a vision. How many of the companies that are in PACE or you've been working with have a real sustainability story within their vision versus a greenwashing story?
Well, that's a complex question in all sorts of directions. What I would say is that most of leaving aside our particular stakeholders, because I'm not sure they're representative of the norm, but most companies out there and most countries actually out there fall into two traps. They either don't set a target that's ambitious enough, or again, they focus it only on one part of the chain. So they say by X year, 2050, too far out, we will have a large proportion of recycled material. In a way, that is failure. That's not actually a meaningful target. It's not a meaningful time frame. What I don't think they have really held themselves to account for is actually material resources. I'd love to see a fashion company, for example, say, in 10 years' time, we will make sure all of our customers buy fewer things. And by the way, those things will be better. If anyone knows of one, please send them my way.
That would be a very powerful statement because going back to your earlier point, most organizations are in that linear economy.
And growth.
Exactly. So it's the mindset growth, it's scarcity, it's profit driven. What you mentioned WF earlier, where it is really within the shareholder capitalism space and WF, and we can debate, whether this is a realistic aspiration or not. The focus on stakeholder capitalism. Has that in any of your work played out and influenced or moved the needle in organizations?
It absolutely has. And interestingly enough, I just happened to spot a question around a country. And I remember I may have said earlier that when you ask citizens what they want, they tend to be more progressive than necessarily institutions from the status quo. And this question is around Chile's rewriting of their constitution to be more aware of ecological limits, and also more protective and more mindful of resources and communities that are being affected. For those who don't know, lithium, Chile is a very large source of lithium, and you're also in a very fragile ecosystem that's water scarce and desertified. So extracting materials and minerals can often make situations like that worse. So I have to say, I really applaud it. The idea of baking in by citizens into their own constitution, the idea of ecological awareness and sanity, I think is a brilliant development. And I hope more countries invite their citizens to take part and do the same.
Even though voters did reject those,
they did, but
changes.
Yeah, but even in Switzerland, where you're sitting, women didn't get the vote till I think it was 1974, because sometimes these things can very much balance on a knife edge. But again, we've created the Overton window. We've expanded the zone of possibility by merely engaging in that process.
Indeed.
By merely putting it on the map, we have changed mindsets. But like, remember I said that experimentation and failure are part of progress? There you go.
Very important reminder. And we, as you know, as a strategic foresight practitioner, we refer to those as signals. And
Yeah.
there are going to be signals that will fail. Many of them will fail, but the signals can begin to create what we would call a driver or a megatrend. And perhaps the efforts of Chile's citizens to rewrite the constitution, could actually encourage other countries to take that kind of initiative in their own hands and ideally successfully make that happen. And one example I think everyone is waiting to see is happening in Brazil with the re-election of Lula. Will that have an influence on policy, constitution, Amazonian rights, and obviously for the forest as a whole? So again, something for us to also track and watch. There was one more question that I saw. It was a bit of recall of what I had asked you earlier. I'd asked you what keeps you up at night. So someone had asked what gets you up in the morning.
Coffee, lots of it. I think just the chance to have a run at these questions. These are very intellectually engaging questions. They're also emotionally engaging because you do feel like the work matters. I did say earlier that it's hard to feel like you win every day, but it's also hard to feel like you lose every day. So the chance to have one more go at this every single day, along with a lot of coffee, is what I get up for.
Wonderful. Ramona, thank you so much. This has been insightful, inspirational, and certainly on behalf of myself and the Institute for the Future, we wish you all the best of luck, strength, resilience to continue your very important mission of mobilizing people for collective action and trying to rebalance the spectrum of climate impact.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. I want to remind everyone that we are continuing our Office Shock talks looking at the spectrums. I'm really excited next week. Now, this is not at all, Ramona, to say that I wasn't excited about this conversation. Next week, I'm even more excited. Going to be speaking with my colleague and good friend, Ibrahim Jackson, about the spectrum of belonging. So, Ramona, we briefly mentioned the importance of belonging, particularly when trying to create a community for collective action. And Ibrahim has got many years of experience and great insights, and he was an advisor for our chapter on belonging. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation as well. Super. All right, Ramona, I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. And I want to thank everyone who joined us for this talk. We will be posting the recording. It'll also be on YouTube in addition to LinkedIn. Feel free to share that with friends. You can also go to officeshock.org where you'll see more information. You'll also see the illustrations, the one that I mentioned earlier about the spectrum of outcomes. You can check that out there and feel free to download it. It was not created by a AI art generator. It was actually created by people. One from Mexico and Israel collaborated on that one. So again, Ramona, I want to thank you so much and look forward to seeing you hopefully next week and everyone else who's joining these talks. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.